So today we're going to be doing a video about exercise tier lists. If you've been on social media for a while, I'm sure you would have seen a tier list before. They're pretty popular in like a meme format or just people ranking things. I've seen people make fast food tier lists. That was quite a popular one for a while. There's like video game character tier lists. There's all kind of tier lists. They're a fun thing to use, but the thing is, I think for exercise selection, they're actually a pretty useful tool. So today we're going to go through why that is and how you can use them yourself. So first of all, what is a tier list? Like I said, they're sort of popular in memes and YouTube videos. If you just Google or go on YouTube and look up, tier list video, you'll see heaps of them. They're a very understandable visual because it's just ranked from top to bottom, usually with S tier being the top, and then A, B, C, D, however many tiers is necessary to demonstrate the thing you're talking about. And something I like about them is tier lists provide a much needed alternative to binary good and bad type setups, or best and worst dichotomies that are often pushed by clickbait content, especially in the fitness world. You see, this is the best exercise, or never do this exercise, because it sells, but in reality, most exercises fit somewhere on a spectrum, and that's exactly what a tier list is. Why is a tier list better than a best exercise? People have been training for a long time now, and even machines, like in your local gym, have existed for decades. So if there really was one best exercise, we definitely would have already found it. And everyone would be doing it because no one's out here trying to waste their own time. So it begs the question, if there even is one best exercise, what happens when you do it for so long that it gets stale and it starts to feel bad or it hurts your joints? What if that best exercise, you do it, everyone tells you it's the best, you see an Athlete X video or something, and it's just not working that well? And what if your goals are different to what the best exercise offers? You could be training for strength, you could be training for hypertrophy or athleticism or rehab or mobility or endurance. There's lots of things you could be training for, and I can guarantee one exercise is not going to be the best for all of those. Just as a quick example, I'll give you guys an outline of a very basic tier list. This is the sort of thing you could come up by yourself on the fly, and obviously you don't need to make a picture of it. This is more just a conceptual idea. This is something you could do in the gym. Let's say, I don't really like making up workouts on the fly, but if you were to do that, you could look around, you could see like 3 or 4 different quad exercises and quickly do an analysis of which one is going to be the best to do at the time. So we're going to focus specifically on hypertrophy training for the quads, so getting bigger quads. We're going to include a number of exercises, and some of these I've heard referred to as the best quad exercise, which already should tell you, if there's more than one that people are calling the best, obviously there's some nuance to this. And I'll give you a brief justification, some rationale for why each one is placed where they are. So, we've got a tier list here, and straight away you'll see up the top in S tier, we've got the leg press. I'm sure some powerlifters and myself, maybe 5 years ago, would get a bit mad about that, but there's a good reason for it. The leg press is quite low fatigue, but extremely high stimulus for the quads and low injury risk. Now, it's not super low fatigue in general, but when you compare it to like a heavy squat or something, it is much less fatiguing. It doesn't use your back anywhere near as much. It focuses on the quads much more, especially if your technique is good. So for sure, quad hypertrophy, leg press is going in the S tier. Now, if we look at the A tier, now we've got the squats. I didn't put them in S tier, but they are still a really good exercise. They're very, very high stimulus, but they are higher fatigue and injury risk than a leg press is. Not that high. The likelihood you get hurt squatting is pretty low. And the fatigue, there's certainly more fatiguing exercises, but man, like a hard set of squats, it's pretty tiring, especially if you're doing high volume. If we were making a strength tier list for powerlifting or just general strength training, squats might be an S tier. but for quad hypertrophy, A is as high as they get. Also in the A tier, we have leg extensions. Now, the reason these are also A tier, even though they're in some ways quite different to squats, is they might actually have a better stimulus to fatigue ratio than even the leg press. However, they're just not that heavy, and unfortunately, a lot of leg extension machines are not designed super well. The range of motion is not perfect. So even though the stimulus to fatigue ratio is usually really, really good, the stimulus magnitude, just the raw stimulus they send to the quads, is not actually that high. If you only did leg extensions, even though the stimulus fatigue ratio is really good, you're gonna have a hard time building really big quads. So under that, in the B tier, I've put the front foot elevated lunge, which is a relatively uncommon exercise. It's becoming a bit more popular these days. I mostly just see girls doing it in the Smith machine, and good for them because it's a pretty good exercise. It's fantastic ROM for the quads. Recently I made a video talking shit about Bulgarian split squats. Not a fan. This is basically just a Bulgarian split squat that is better in every way. The knee, when you do these with enough of an elevation, can fully close. So completely ass to grass. Some people might be able to get more knee flexion on this than even a squat. So the range of motion for the quads is fantastic, but the potential for loading is lower. It's harder to lift heavy weights with this one. And also, depending on your build and how you set it up, they might be working the glutes more than they're working the quads, which is still cool, makes it a good glute exercise. But if we're just trying to focus on the quads, this one's a B tier. After that, in the C tier, we've got just regular lunges. They're an okay exercise. I don't do them that much, especially if I can do front foot elevated lunges. They're basically the same, but less range of motion for the quads. So still pretty good for the glutes, but again, if we're focused on the quads, just a strictly worse version of a front foot elevated lunge. Gonna be real, probably still better than Bulgarian split squats. I'm gonna be hating on those forever. So yeah, lunges not terrible, but not a top pick. Then in the D tier, I've got box squats. I've done box squats before. I've gotten injured doing box squats before, and there's different types of box squats. Today we're talking about the classic west side style, sort of around or even above parallel box squat, usually quite heavy. I'm going to be real with you, this is one of the worst quad exercises that are still technically a quad exercise. Terrible range of motion, often not even going halfway down. They are extremely fatiguing because due to sitting on the box and the range of motion, you can lift way more weight, so way more axial loading of the spine. Really terrible stimulus, because even though the weight is so heavy, because the ROM is bad, the stimulus is not even that good. And the injury risk is way higher. Like I said before, I've gotten injured doing these. I compacted my spine, which granted, I wasn't doing them as well as I should have been. But it's, technique aside, anytime the weights are heavier, and in box squats, they can be really heavy, the injury risk is higher. And then especially depending on what kind of box you're using and just how good your technique is, yeah, these can be dangerous. Doesn't mean there's never a time to do them. There's some niche times where box squats might be called for. But I'll be real, if this tier list went below D, I couldn't fit it in the little picture we've got here. These wouldn't even be as high as D tier. These would be lower than that. It's just, that's the diagram we've got. Okay, so how do you use tier lists in your own training? You could, if you wanted to, take the time, just make a bunch of them for future reference, like literally make the pictures and add new exercises to them whenever you try them out. But that takes a long time. Even putting this little one together for this video took some time. So unless you really want to, it's not like you have to do that. But just having them in your head conceptually, the idea of how tier lists work, a spectrum from really, really good exercises to really crap exercises can be a useful conceptual framework to use on the fly. And at some point we might even make a video doing an on the fly tier list so you can kind of see how you might do that. They can help you prioritize exercise selection for a new training cycle. So you've just finished up your mesocycle, finished your cut or bulk or whatever it is, or finished your hypertrophy phase. You're doing something new. Maybe you look at the tier list when you're deciding what exercises to pick. Making them though, conceptually or actually making the pictures of them, requires at least a basic understanding of training concepts. So for example, which exercise works which muscles. I really hope that's something you know by now. Stimulus to fatigue ratio, a little bit more complex, but pretty easy to figure out still, and so on and so forth. So here's a good question that I've often heard posed in tier list content of any kind, not just exercise related stuff. Why would you not just exclusively use the top tier exercises? If your top tiers, S and A, have enough exercises in them to provide adequate variation and not get stale, why would you not only use those? It's a good question. The first thing I'd say is sometimes you might not. Sometimes you might only have one S tier and one or two A tiers, and it's just not enough variation. Those will get stale eventually. But even if you've got a few in there, you could just rotate between them. An exercise's position on your personal tier list, what works for you, can change over time based on numerous factors. So maybe a B tier or C tier, maybe even a D tier exercise can have just one beneficial factor, which could at any given moment be the most important one for you. So for example, maybe it's got poor stimulus and poor loadability, but very, very good for mobility training. And maybe you just need to work on mobility. So while that exercise normally sucks, it actually would be relevant then, even though it's in a lower tier. So if a given muscle as well is deprioritized, it's not as important, using a lower tier exercise, especially if it's also a low fatigue exercise, can give your higher tier exercises time to lose the staleness for when you need to prioritize that muscle. As a personal example, recently I just haven't been focused on chest training. It's just been in maintenance mode or just training hard enough to grow a little, not the main focus. And I've been using some machines in the gym to train my chest, which I haven't used much before. I never liked them. I didn't like how they feel. I just felt like they were inferior to bench press and dumbbell bench and these other good exercises, ones that for me might be A tier or S tier. These machines would normally be like a C or D tier, but I just don't care about training my chest that much at the moment. And I spent so long spamming bench press, I got pretty strong at it, but it's really tiring and I was just kind of sick of doing it. So while my chest doesn't matter that much to me, I'll use these machines. And one thing is doing it for a while, they actually started to feel a little better. Maybe they're better than I realized. But the other thing is when I need to train my chest, I go back to bench press, I go back to inclined dumbbells or whatever. They feel fantastic. I'm not sick of them anymore. And I can use my best exercises as much as possible when it matters. And then when it doesn't matter, maybe I don't use them. So I'll leave you with some takeaways. You definitely should stop worrying about what the best exercise is or about, never do this exercise. Stop thinking like that. It's not very productive. The only exercises you should never do are ones that just hurt every time you do them. And even then, if something hurts a bit, give it some time, see if you can improve it, improve the technique. Maybe it's really good. You'd hate to miss out on a good exercise unnecessarily, but sometimes you do one, it just always feels terrible, it always hurts. Okay, sure, you don't have to do that one. Very reasonable. But don't think of these things as like, this is the best one, this is the worst one. You know what I mean? There's a spectrum to these things. You want to have a wide variety of viable exercises for all purposes, okay? Especially if you're not just a power lifter or Olympic lifter, if you play sports, if you're interested in physique, most of the reason that people train for just health and fitness, there's no limitation on what you can do. So you want to have as many good exercises under your belt as possible. You really should be understanding what an exercise's pros and cons are. If I ask you why you're doing an exercise or why you're not doing an exercise, you should be able to give me a pretty concise description of it that is actually relatively accurate, ideally. And also to unfortunately get a little bit more condescending, is condescending the right word, maybe patronizing with this, you should understand what is a pro and what is a con. Not just for that exercise, but just in general. I've talked to a lot of boomers in the gym over the years who seem to think that just because something is hard, that makes it good. That's just not true. If something is hard and doesn't work, that is a bad thing. If something's easy and it works really well, that's about as good as it could be. Making things harder for the sake of making things harder is always dumb, because if something works well and is easy, you could just do it more. You could just do it better and more and put more effort into it and exponentially get more results, instead of doing something harder that gives you less results. Like, it's incredibly basic stuff. So really think about what a pro is and what a con is, what you actually want, what is good and what is bad, and then think about the pros and cons of individual exercises. On a tangent for that one, please stop turning off the fans in your local gym so you can sweat more. If you want to sweat more, just exercise harder or go outside. Okay, it's pretty hot here in Australia. Leave the fans on, train harder. Okay, you're not doing better just because you're sweating more. So to get on with this, pick mostly high tier exercises. If you're looking at that tier list, yeah, the S tiers, the A tiers, maybe the B tiers, that's what you're going to be doing 90% of the time. But just remember that the low tiers do have some potential applicability. And occasionally you should revisit exercises that are in those low tiers to see if their value has changed. Maybe your mobility is different now, maybe your skill level is different, maybe you don't have a joint problem you had before, and suddenly something you thought was a C tier is actually really good. Now, that's happened to me recently with some of these chest machines. Lastly, you should consider enjoyment as a factor. It just should not be the sole decider. Okay, if you're the kind of person who can just work really hard, you're a workaholic, you're an absolute machine, the kind of person who maybe actually has to worry about overtraining and burning out, you should enjoy training, certainly. You should enjoy the process of it, and for the most part, you should enjoy a lot of the exercises that you do. But if you're doing a D tier exercise instead of an S tier exercise just because you like it, don't be surprised when your gains are mediocre. So maybe ask yourself whether it's more important that you like this exercise or that you like the results of this exercise. And often those things are going to go hand in hand. You're going to like the exercise, you pick one you like, you train it hard, you get good results. But you need to do exercises that actually lead to the results you want if you want those results. And being process oriented, I hear people discuss this a lot. All it really means is that you like doing the things that get you results as much or more than you like the results. So, again, enjoyment, very legitimate factor. You don't want to get burnt out. It's very hard to train when you hate your training, but you should try to learn to enjoy things that work well. I think that's everything. I would encourage you to make a bit of a tier list, even if it's just in the notes on your phone. You don't have to make a little infographic or whatever. Just sort of write it out. Think about what your best exercises are. Just pick a muscle group, pick a bunch of exercises you like, put them in order. Just give it a go, Maybe put it in the comments if you want to.